Of course, during the pandemic, the real estate space has been of great interest, particularly residential. We know that prices have been soaring, and it perhaps keeps an entire generation in the rental market. So let's turn our attention to Canadian Apartment Properties REIT. They're out with their latest earnings, and of course, the larger trends in the real estate market playing a role into what we saw there. Mark Kenney is the president and CEO of Canadian Apartment Properties REIT and joins us now. And Mark, as I went through the numbers, I found it very interesting that despite the strains of the pandemic, you collected 99% of your rents year to date. What do you sort of ascribe that the renter ability to pay their rents to?
Well, I think what it really is saying to us, and I've said this before, is that Canadians definitely value their home, and shelter is a fundamental need. And when you look at CAPREIT in our portfolio, we're very much positioned in the mid-tier part of the market, and that part of the market's been quite resilient.
Resilient in the sense of being mid-tier as well. And I think about all the government support programs that have been put into place, and they were put into place for workers pretty early in the pandemic to try to ensure that if you did lose your income, you still had income. Do you think that played a role too in the fact that even though we went pretty heavily into deficit and debt, we did carry for the most part Canadians through this?
Yeah, I think so. Like the numbers, we don't have full visibility on the number of people that are receiving assistance, but we can only imagine that it has to be substantial. But I think Canada did the right thing by keeping people safe and calm through this pandemic, and no doubt the assistance has helped.
Now, when we take a look at some of the trends that we've seen in terms of residential properties changing hands, bit of a different business, obviously, that you're in, but there has been this story about people leaving the urban cores, getting further out of the city because they could work from home. When it comes to your business, does that play out through rent renewals? What is that looking like lately?
Yeah, I think that story is a little bit misunderstood. I think when you look at our business and a lot of our peers, what's happened is you've had this cohort of renters that are under 30 years of age that went home to mom and dad to be safe during the pandemic. So when you're renting, you have the ability to give notice and leave. And I think for safety reasons, that's exactly what's happened. Because when we look at our buildings that have had vacancy issues, for example, it's all that cohort. And in the CAPREIT portfolio, the hundreds of buildings that we only have about 10 buildings that are truly affected with vacancy. And it's exactly that cohort of under 30s.
Now, REIT investors will often look to borrowing costs, bond yields, in terms of trying to form a strategy about their investments in the REIT space. All the talk this week, of course, has been about inflation because it goes back to the central banks, goes back to borrowing costs. How carefully are you watching all this talk about inflation and how it could force a central bank's hand? What do you think it looks like longer term?
Well, longer term, like real estate's always been the great hedge against inflation. You know, you invest in real estate and really protect yourself on an inflation point of view. When we think about what's going to be happening, we really just focus on our real estate. And the CAPREIT philosophy has always been long-term debt, 10-year money. So when we do buy acquisitions, we finance them long-term, 10, 15 years, and then we don't have to worry. So when it comes to looking at what's coming down the track, we keep our debt ladder long and smooth. So there's never 1 year that we get impacted. But I think the world is going to be facing tremendous debt levels, and how governments manage that and central banks manage that is to be seen. But certainly the environment that we see right now is one of incredibly low financing rates.
Coming out of the pandemic, what is the opportunity for CAPREIT? Obviously, our lives got turned upside down. We're vaccinating more and more Canadians every day. At some point, life's going to look something like normal. How does CAPREIT progress in that environment?
I think what we have to remember that the rental market is seeing a little bit of weakness. You know, CAPREIT's vacancies hit 3%, and for that, those kind of numbers, that was what we would characterize as weakness. But again, it's really this phenomenon of under 30s going home. So the way we see it is as vaccines get rolled out as they are right now, we will see a return of the under 30s leaving home to go back into independent living. And let's face it, like our population didn't get smaller during the pandemic and the supply didn't increase. The weakness was created, again, by this household consolidation effect. And what Canada is staring down is ramped up immigration numbers for the years to come. So unless something is significantly done with supply, we're going to find ourselves right back to where we were in Q1 of 2020, which is a supply-constrained market.
What do you think longer term is the supply issue, right? I mean, that's the great debate in Canadian real estate about what the drivers are in the market, the lack of supply, the cheap money. If we need to get more supply online, what's going to be the solution? What teams need to work together?
The three levels of government. At the end of the day, it's all about zoning, and it's all about finding that compromise between sensible immigration policy, which we all embrace, but also fair housing policy to match that. We can't bring people to the country without giving great thought to housing policy. And today in Canada, like many countries, you've got the immigration driver being your big population driver, but the decisions around zoning to build housing are municipal. So it's finding that balance between don't build in my backyard and embracing immigration, as we all should as Canadians, and getting those two levels of government on the same page. You've got the poor province right in the middle of this problem, who are ultimately responsible for the solution. But you've got supply coming from the feds, you've got demand coming from the feds through population increases, and supply ultimately dictated by the municipalities.